The Titanic lies nearly 2,500 feet below the surface, and today the only safe way to investigate it is with an ROV. Deep inside collapsed passageways, one cabin door still shows up in the beam of light. Closed. Intact enough to raise one simple question: why was that door never opened? What could still be behind it? Suitcases, letters, personal belongings, practical clues from that night. If you enjoy historical Titanic documentaries, hit like and subscribe. Now let's get as close as possible, without touching a thing. Before any emergency begins, the ship works like an organized city. Corridors, schedules, service, and clearly defined internal routes. The crew moves through it with keys, lists, and procedures, keeping cabins and public spaces running like a floating hotel. That routine matters because the moment something goes wrong, those same routes can turn into choke points. A comfortable hallway can become a funnel, and a door meant for privacy can suddenly become a delay. Have you ever thought about how the difference between getting out in time or getting lost might start with the address of your room? That's why the investigation begins with routine. A cabin's location is not just a number on the door. It is a position inside a circulation system. It determines how close you are to stairways, main corridors, and service areas. In normal conditions, that means comfort. In a crisis, it becomes time, information, and access. Once the ship starts changing angle, frames and locks can jam, and passages that look obvious on a deck plan stop working in real life. What the ROV finds today: a blockage, a gap, a wall of debris. It may be the direct result of that geometry shifting. If you had been there, would you have known which route to choose without hesitation? The type of cabin followed the travel patterns of 1912, and that shaped what stayed inside. Trunks, cases, clothing, documents, letters. That is not sensationalism. It is a record of daily life. It also shaped how information moved, because some corridors saw more crew traffic while others stayed more isolated. In an emergency, that difference matters. People who notice trouble early tend to move early. People who wait for confirmation often lose precious minutes. Have you noticed how the mind tries to normalize danger just to stay comfortable? On the Titanic, that instinct could cost you the way back.
Okay, stabilizing the gain now. We've got a clear view.
A cabin is a capsule of interrupted routine. A closed suitcase, an envelope, an object left where it was. On the ocean floor, none of that is truly intact. It is fragile. Sediment preserves and erases at the same time. It protects details, but it also turns into a cloud with one wrong move. That is why the ROV has to keep its distance, control its thrusters, and often back away. The real question here is not can it be opened? It is can it be observed without destroying it? In underwater archaeology, the best decision is often to stop before the touch. That night, the North Atlantic was bitterly cold, and the danger of ice was well known in navigation. On deck, lookout and procedure followed their routine. Scan the horizon, stay alert in the dark sea. But for the people inside, the crossing still felt normal. Distant music, warm corridors, closed cabins. That contrast delayed the sense of danger. A lot of people instinctively wait for someone to explain what is happening before they act. Have you ever been in a situation where everyone reacts late because nobody wants to seem dramatic? On a ship, that hesitation turns into precious minutes lost. The contact with the ice was far more consistent with a glancing scrape along the side than with a head-on collision. To someone standing in a warm corridor, that may have seemed minor, but below the surface, it compromised a chain of spaces along the hull. Water found its way in and the situation changed fast, even if the feeling above was little more than a vibration and a sense that something was off. That gap between perception and reality is central to understanding the decisions people made. If you heard it was just a bump, you would probably wait. If you saw water or heard a technical order, you would move. In that gap, the internal routes were already starting to fail.
The team approaches the mysterious suitcase, navigating the delicate debris field with extreme caution.
In the first few minutes, some areas still looked normal, and that created a false sense of safety. Information did not reach everyone the same way. The bridge, the technical sections, and the main corridors formed layers. Some people opened their doors, looked out, and saw no reason to hurry. Others were told to move up without fully understanding why. That imbalance created different choices and delays that kept building. Have you noticed how in confusion each person acts on the small piece of truth they have? On the Titanic, that determined who entered the right flow and who got trapped in zones that later became dead ends. The technical response was about containment. Isolate sections and try to buy time with watertight doors and emergency procedures. But time does not expand, it shrinks. As water advanced, the added weight pulled the bow down and changed the balance, altering the geometry inside. Doors began to scrape, corridors tilted, loose objects turned into obstacles. At the same time, the crew still had to guide passengers and keep people moving. It was a mechanical and human problem at once. What we now see on the ocean floor as an inaccessible point may have been, that night, a route that failed in a matter of minutes. In an emergency, many people think about going back to their room, to grab a coat, a document, a small bag. It is a human reaction. The mind tries to keep control through what feels familiar, but that just 1 minute can cost an entire route. You go back and find a busier corridor, a door that sticks, a stairway that has turned into a line. By the time you realize it, you are already behind the main movement. Has that ever happened to you? Insisting on one more thing and later thinking, I should have left? On the Titanic, that chain of small decisions helps explain why certain areas were left behind before the rest of the ship fully understood what was happening. Once the evacuation begins to take shape, the ship turns into direction and movement. Lines forming, routes leading up to the boat deck, wooden lifeboats being readied in their davits. The crew tries to maintain order in the cold and the wind, even as the list grows steeper. Cork life jackets covered in canvas start appearing everywhere, and the deck becomes a point of convergence. Those who arrive early have more options. Those who arrive late face blocked flow and doors that can no longer be trusted. If you enjoy this kind of reconstruction built on evidence and procedure, subscribe to the channel. Because from here on, we are going to connect what the ROV sees today with the roots and decisions of that night. As the angle increases, corridors that once felt solid begin to change shape. Doors start scraping against their frames and objects slide, creating barriers. The crew tries to keep paths open, but some points stop being routes and become bottlenecks. In that kind of environment, a cabin can be left behind without anyone ever making a formal decision. What the ROV finds today as a blockage may have started as something simple. One jammed door, followed by debris, then partial collapse. The practical question is this: at what minute did that path stop existing? Understanding that helps explain why some doors are still closed today. As the angle grows steeper, the structure starts working against the doors. Latch, hinge, and frame stop lining up. At the same time, technical sections are trying to isolate spaces to slow the advance of water, and every closure changes the ship's real map. In some places, everything may still have looked lit and orderly, but the internal geometry was already deforming. A door that once opened with a touch begins to require force. Then it jams for good. Have you ever tried to force something stuck and realized you were only making it worse? On the Titanic, that happened on the scale of a ship, with direct consequences for escape routes. This is the point where time stops being merely urgent and becomes scarce. On deck, launching lifeboats demands order in the cold and the wind, with the deck itself shifting underfoot. Inside, the sounds of the hull and the vibration signal structural stress, not just discomfort. Water pushes forward and some routes fail almost at the same time. This is when small decisions, going back, waiting, looking for someone, become costly. Have you ever felt that jolt in your stomach when you realize you have passed the point of no return? For many people, that moment came without any clear warning, only through the ship changing its behavior. The overall sequence is consistent. The bow goes down first, dragged by the weight of the water pouring in. Then the structure enters extreme stress, and the ship breaks apart. The stern stays raised for a time, then begins its own descent. For those in the water, the outline of the ship changes fast and the lights vanish in stages. This is not cinematic effect. It is physics, mass distribution, flooding, structural resistance. And every stage determines what breaks loose, what sinks first, and how the debris field forms. What the ROV now sees scattered across the seafloor is the direct result of that sequence. After the ship disappears from the surface, a different story begins. The fall of objects and sections through the deep ocean. Items descend at different speeds and spread out, forming a debris field. Sediment behaves like dust. It covers, preserves, and at the same time can erase details if it is stirred up. That is why, with an ROV, the rule is to observe without touching and to back away when visibility starts to collapse. A half-buried suitcase may look like just a suitcase, but it is historical context. And context only survives if the site stays intact. Curiosity without method leads to loss. At the surface, the sinking became news in fragments. Telegrams, incomplete lists, uncertainty lasting for days. Ports turned into places of waiting, and newsrooms tried to confirm facts without seeing the full picture. That interval of doubt is part of the historical impact. The world understood the disaster gradually, not all at once. That helps explain why the site is now treated as a memorial and protected heritage. It is not just steel on the seafloor. It is a record of lives and decisions. And when we talk about opening a door, we are also talking about how that memory is preserved. Ethically, the rule is often simple: document, do not damage. Decades later, the search became patient technical work. Maps, glowing screens, crews comparing data until shapes finally matched what history described. In 1985, confirmation came when riveted structures and the debris field appeared in the beam of light. This was never treasure hunting. It was historical verification. From that moment on, every approach had to balance scientific curiosity with preservation. The interior is fragile and sediment is a constant enemy. One wrong move and the camera goes blind. That is why some areas remain documented only from the outside. Seeing is possible. Entering is not always worth the cost. Entering the interior is nothing like walking into a building on land. A small burst from a thruster can lift sediment and erase the image. One touch on a single piece can shift an entire section and trigger collapse. Many passages are narrow, lined with hanging debris and almost no clearance. That is why serious procedure means stopping, observing, backing away, and trying a different angle. Very often, the best decision is not to move forward. And that creates real limits for the investigation. Some doors and corridors are literally out of reach without causing damage. When the ROV stops in front of a blockage, it is also recording a choice to preserve. Some cabins remain inaccessible for plain physical reasons. Bent steel plates, collapsed ceilings, and beams wedged in place like braces. In other cases, sediment makes any entry destructive because the smallest movement turns everything into a cloud. Even when there is a narrow opening, the risk of losing visibility and displacing objects is high. And there is still the ethical limit. Forcing a way in may destroy the very context that makes the space valuable. In this setting, inaccessible often means inaccessible without destruction. That is why a closed door can be more useful closed than opened. Without meaning to, it preserves the original scene. If a cabin was isolated early, it is plausible that personal belongings may still exist in something close to their original position, partly preserved, partly degraded. Suitcases, envelopes, small bottles, cases, everyday items. These are realistic possibilities. No extravagant theory is required. This is archaeology in an extreme environment. The value is not in a rare object, but in context, where it was, how it was positioned, what lay beside it. And that context is the first thing to vanish when someone starts moving things around to get a better look. That is why every hypothesis must walk hand in hand with minimal impact method. The ROV does not open, it documents. Opening or forcing an entry can destroy exactly what researchers are trying to understand. Stirred sediment buries details, and any vibration can shift lightweight objects, scrambling the record of the site. Materials like wood and fabric may disintegrate with contact, current, or a change in support. So the technical question becomes brutally simple. Can the site be investigated without altering it? If the answer is no, the information gained may not justify the irreversible loss. In serious research, do not touch is an active decision, not a lack of nerve. That is where the mystery becomes less mystical and more practical. The door stays closed because opening it may cost too much. And the price here is lost history. The wreck is not just a structure. It is a site bound to victims and collective memory. That changes the standard for intervention. Documenting is not the same as removing, and exploration is not the same as looting. That is why preservation practices limit actions inside the wreck, especially in spaces that may contain human traces or belongings directly tied to those who were there. The responsible decision is usually the coldest and most technical one: minimize impact. If there is doubt, back away. Does that feel anticlimactic? Maybe. But that is how history remains available to future generations and future technologies that may one day observe more while destroying less. In that sense, the closed door becomes a line of respect. Beyond ethics, there are rules and agreements that treat the Titanic as heritage and memorial, setting limits on intervention. That includes conservation principles and the need to justify research, especially when the risk of damage is high. Even with modern technology, this is not a free-for-all. Any operation must demonstrate method and necessity, and often the strongest case is to leave the site intact. That is why modern investigation prioritizes imaging, mapping, and documentation instead of aggressive physical access. The closed door becomes proof of discipline. The goal is not to conquer the wreck, it is to understand it. And sometimes understanding means accepting the limit. When access comes with loss, do not open becomes the most logical decision. The closed door on the seafloor is not just mystery, it is a boundary of preservation. It protects context, reduces the risk of collapse, and prevents a historical record from being turned into rubble. The ROV shows enough to understand the problem: sensitive sediment, blockages, structural fragility. The question stops being, can it be opened, and becomes, is it worth opening? In many cases, it is not, because the act of opening may erase more information than it reveals. It sounds counterintuitive, but that is how conservation works. History may be inside, but the evidence only matters if it still exists after the attempt. That door represents interrupted routine and split-second decisions aboard a ship changing shape minute by minute. It also represents the boundary between curiosity and preservation. Whatever may exist behind it is probably simple: ordinary belongings, fragments of daily life, a scene frozen in time and later swallowed by sediment. The value is not treasure, it is historical context. And context is fragile. One touch, one cloud of silt, one shift in position, and the meaning begins to vanish. That is why the best investigation sometimes ends with retreat. The closed door keeps telling its story precisely because it remains closed. The wreck remains in darkness and the door remains closed. Not because the technology is missing, but because fragility and choice matter. The ROV can illuminate and record, but it cannot replace what is lost the moment something is disturbed. The Titanic is still a physical document of one specific night with real human consequences. Maybe future techniques will let us observe more without damage. Maybe that door will never be opened.
This video is an AI historical reconstruction based on records from the time, created for educational and narrative purposes.
And if that is the case, it still serves a purpose, reminding us that history is also what we choose to preserve. If you want more documentaries like this, grounded in investigation and context, subscribe to the channel. The next expedition begins in the next video.